This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about a system quietly reaching the edge of its own authority. What you saw today was not chaos. It was control being tested. Slowly, publicly, on the record. For a long time in this country, power has relied on something fragile. Not force, not violence, compliance. The assumption that when a rule is spoken, it will be followed. That when a boundary is set, it will hold. Today, that assumption wavered, not collapsed, not yet. But it bent, and when systems bend in public, they rarely snap immediately. They stretch first. If you're still watching, it's because you can feel it. Something here matters more than the moment itself. Stay with me. Because what happened next wasn't dramatic. It was structural. And once you see the structure, you can't unsee where this is going. What actually controls the system right now is not law. It's expectation, the expectation that authority will be obeyed without having to prove itself, that a command doesn't need enforcement because enforcement has never been questioned. For decades, that expectation carried the weight. Courts spoke, institutions acted. Most people complied. But systems don't fail when rules disappear. They fail when obedience becomes optional. What you witnessed was not a challenge to a rule. It was a challenge to whether the rule still had teeth. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Authority only exists if defiance is costly. The moment defiance becomes performative, strategic, repeatable, the balance shifts. Not loudly, quietly. And the danger isn't that someone breaks the rules. It's that the system hesitates to respond the same way it always has. That hesitation is where power drains out. And once power drains, it doesn't rush back in. It leaks slowly, which brings us to how this shift didn't start today. It started long before anyone noticed. This didn't happen overnight. The most dangerous changes never do. Before, defiance was rare, isolated, costly. When it happened, the response was immediate, clear, predictable. Now, defiance has been normalized, not as rebellion, as strategy. Before, silence in a courtroom meant respect. Now, silence can be tactical, calculated, a pause before escalation. Before, pressure came after rulings. Now, pressure arrives before them through timing, through attention, through repetition. And here's the shift most people missed. The system adapted to disruption instead of stopping it. Rules stayed the same. Responses softened. Consequences stretched out over time. That's how erosion works. Not with explosions. With adjustments, each adjustment feels reasonable, temporary, manageable, until one day the system realizes it has trained itself to tolerate behavior it once stopped immediately. And when tolerance replaces enforcement, the next moment isn't louder. It's closer. Because once defiance becomes routine, the system has already lost something it may not be able to reclaim. And today wasn't the first sign. It was just the first moment the system hesitated on camera. Then the system was forced to react, not in theory, not in commentary. In real time, a command was issued. Simple, unambiguous. Follow it or face confinement. That line matters because it's almost never spoken aloud. Not to someone with this much visibility, not with this many eyes watching. For a moment, everything stopped. Not because the outcome was unclear, but because the consequences were suddenly real. Security shifted, lawyers moved, the room recalculated. And here's the part that should unsettle you. The rule didn't fail. The response arrived exactly as written, but it didn't land immediately. There was a pause, a gap, a measurable stretch of time where the system waited to see if it would be obeyed. That wait wasn't procedural. It was existential, because in that space, authority had to prove it still existed. And it almost had to do it the hard way. If you think this was about order in one room, you're missing the point. This was a test. and the next test doesn't stay contained. Here's how the system actually works. Not on paper. In practice, rules are written to be universal, but enforcement is calibrated. The higher the visibility, the more cautious the response. The more attention, the more hesitation, not because the rules change, but because the consequences multiply. When authority acts against someone powerful, it absorbs shock, media pressure, political backlash, institutional risk. So the system does what systems are trained to do. It manages exposure, warnings first, escalation second, force only as a last resort. And that creates an imbalance. Those with less power feel consequences immediately. Those with more power generate delay. Delay isn't mercy, it's leverage. Because every extra minute creates narrative space. Every pause invites performance. Every warning becomes a stage. This is who benefits, not the law, not stability. The benefit goes to the actor willing to test limits publicly. And the cost doesn't disappear. It gets absorbed by courts, by institutions, by the assumption that authority will hold without having to show its teeth. But systems that refuse to show their teeth teach the wrong lesson. They teach that pressure works. And once that lesson spreads, the next confrontation doesn't ask. It demands. Pressure multiplies not in one place, everywhere at once. Inside the room, rules are tested. Outside, narratives are deployed, statements, posts, motions, timing, all moving in parallel. This isn't emotion, it's orchestration. One action distracts, another delays. A third reframes the conflict, and the system has to respond to all of it simultaneously. That's the trap, because institutions are linear. They rule in sequence, they process step by step, but disruption isn't linear. It's layered. While one warning is issued, another challenge is already underway. While authority reasserts itself in one space, it's questioned in another. Nothing collapses. Not yet, but load accumulates. Judges adapt. Lawyers intervene. Security recalibrates. Each adjustment looks responsible. Each one adds friction, and friction slows response, which is the point. Because when Defiance learns the system's rhythm, it stops reacting. It starts pacing. And once Defiance sets the pace, authority is no longer in control. It's chasing, and systems that chase eventually trip. Here's where this reaches you. Not as a headline, as a condition, because when authority hesitates at the top, it tightens at the bottom. You feel it as delay, as uncertainty, as rules that seem to change depending on who's standing in front of them. You wait longer. You comply faster. You absorb consequences quietly. You don't get warnings that stretch. You don't get pauses to negotiate compliance. The system doesn't lean back when it speaks to you. And that's the fracture. When enforcement becomes selective, trust doesn't erode loudly. It thins. You start asking different questions. Not what are the rules, but who are they for? That question changes behavior. It makes unresolved authority contagious. If this feels unsettling, good. It means you're still paying attention. Stay here. Because what happens when this imbalance spreads isn't theoretical. It's already moving. And once it crosses borders, legal, political, geographic, it stops being manageable. It becomes systemic. This doesn't stay contained. Systems watch each other. When authority is tested in one place and doesn't immediately snap back, it sends a signal. Not through speeches, through precedent. Other institutions notice, other governments notice, other actors with power notice, because the question isn't local, it's universal. What happens when visible defiance meets visible restraint? In some places, it becomes imitation. In others, escalation. In others, justification. Courts abroad cite it quietly. Political movements reference it indirectly. Strongmen point to it without naming it, not to copy the moment, but to test their own systems the same way. Pressure here creates permission elsewhere. And once that permission circulates, the idea spreads faster than any ruling can contain it. Authority begins to feel conditional, dependent on context, on audience, on risk tolerance. That's when systems stop being anchors. They become negotiators, and negotiators, by definition, can be pushed, which brings us to what happens next. Because when conditional authority becomes visible, the future doesn't arrive evenly. It accelerates in more than one direction. From here, the system has three paths. The first is adjustment. Authority recalibrates, enforcement becomes faster. Consequences arrive without hesitation. Not harsher, just immediate. This path restores balance, but at a cost. It requires institutions to absorb backlash openly, to accept short-term shock, to preserve long-term control. The second path is erosion. Nothing breaks. Nothing snaps. Warnings multiply. Delays normalize. Exceptions expand quietly. Compliance becomes negotiable for some, mandatory for others. The system still functions, but unevenly. Trust thins further. Pressure builds invisibly. And then there's the third path, rupture. This is where a direct order meets open refusal, where authority is forced to act publicly or concede permanently. No delay, no workaround, no mediation, just action. Rupture doesn't announce itself in advance. It arrives when the system runs out of room to bend. Which path unfolds isn't decided by one moment. It's decided by what happens next. And that decision hasn't been made yet, because the final test isn't about rules. It's about whether the system still believes in itself. Nothing ended today. What you witnessed wasn't closure, it was exposure. A system revealing where it holds firm and where it hesitates. Authority doesn't collapse all at once. It flickers. It dims in moments like this, when obedience becomes a question instead of a reflex. And the most dangerous part isn't defiance, it's what comes after. The recalculations, the quiet testing, the next person watching closely and learning where the edges are. Because once the edges are visible, they invite pressure. This isn't about punishment, it's about precedent. Whether rules remain commands or become suggestions depends on what happens next. And that answer isn't written yet. If you're still here, it's because you know this story doesn't end in a courtroom. It continues in every institution that has to decide whether to act or wait. Stay with me, because the next moment won't announce itself as historic. It will look procedural, ordinary, and by the time it feels undeniable, the system will already be somewhere new. If you want to understand where that is and why it's time to keep watching,